ready to get started. So thank you for everyone who's joining us from wherever you are. My name is Trinity, and I help to organize the events and programs at the Woodlawn and Pope-Leighey House, a historic site in Alexandria, Virginia. As a historic venue, telling the full, truthful story of this site is core to our mission. We are home to two iconic properties, the Pope-Leighey House, a Frank Lloyd Wright designed home, and Woodlawn. Woodlawn, a former plantation, was originally a part of George Washington's Mount Vernon. Its owner, Nellie Custis Lewis, was a step-granddaughter of George Washington. She and her husband Lawrence enslaved over 90 people between 1805 and 1839. Nellie is one of America's foremost needleworkers, and as a plantation site, she benefited from significant contributions of the enslaved people who historically were weavers, spinners, and quilters, as well as labored on the site, which allowed Nellie the luxury of working on her needlework craft. At the site this month, we are hosting our 58th annual needlework show with hundreds of brilliant needlework pieces displayed throughout the house. Now, before I introduce our presenter, I would like to quickly go over a few items with you. Please keep your microphones muted and cameras off, but we'd like you to be aware that this session is being recorded. And if your camera or microphone happens to be on, your image and voice may be incidentally shown as part of the call in future materials. For best viewing, we recommend that you change your screen to speaker view. And you can do this by clicking on the top right hand of your screen, there's a view button, and going down to side-by-side speaker. At any point during the presentation, please feel free to type your questions and comments into the chat section. You should see a chat button at the bottom of your screen. We will facilitate sharing your questions from this chat during our Q&A session at the end of the demonstration. Now I'm excited to introduce needle arts instructor, Deborah Merrick-Wilson. Deborah is a skilled needle arts instructor with over 35 years of experience lecturing and teaching dimensional embroidery, traditional English, and interpretive gold work internationally for many well-known needle art groups, guilds, and organizations. She has authored over 500 stitch guides, written articles for numerous publications, was awarded certificates with distinction from the Royal School of Needlework, and has won numerous awards at the Woodlawn annual needlework shows. She is on the faculty of the Smithsonian Institution Studio Arts program and exhibited her work at Smithsonian events. She has a passion for dimensional and precious embroidery. And yeah, so great to have you here with us, Deborah.
Thank you so much, Trinity. It's my pleasure to be here. I want to welcome everyone who's attending. And as we take a little tour and I'll have a little discussion of the history of precious metal embroidery, excuse me, particularly English precious metal embroidery dating between medieval and Tudor England. But first, a little bit of background. We know that man has always, from the first time he found gold in the earth and saw the shine of it, it's always been very highly prized. I'm going to put my glasses on to refer to some of my notes. During prehistory, we have found garments I speak with my hands, I've got to watch that. Garments that have had pieces of gold attached to them, either with some leather or some sinew. So we know that it goes back, the adoration of gold goes back a very, very long time. And it is thought that prehistoric man probably thought that the gold that they mined from the ground came from the sun on which they were dependent for their own sustenance. Now, as we go into the Bible, as we go a little bit farther forward, we know there are many references of cloth of gold in the Bible. We know that it was highly prized and considered a sign of status, wealth, and success, we also know, always find it amusing that the Elizabeth Taylor performance or costume that she wore in the film Cleopatra was modeled after stories about how when the Romans entered Egypt, she was swathed in gold as part of the story about her. Now, precious metal embroidery played a very, very important part in the development of heraldry. When we saw civilization dividing into tribal clans, one had to have a symbol of that clan. One of the main reasons was because as you were fighting your enemy, you needed to identify who the enemy was so that you knew who to bonk over the head with your club. And originally, we saw things like you saw in the film Braveheart, when the Scottish rebels had painted their skin with blue woad, and you could tell who was the enemy and who was not. But as we progressed farther forward and painting advanced and embroidery or the embellishment of textiles advanced, heraldry was an absolutely perfect medium for this to really grow. And we see it in as early as the 11th century. We see wonderful pieces of clothing that are either for religious clergy or for wealthy people, and to put their symbols on their badges and their horse trappers and their standards, as well as just their clothing. And one of the thoughts was, as you were building your army, you not only wanted to be able to identify who your friend and who your foe was, but as you were bearing down on your enemy, you wanted to look really good when you were doing it. And so we saw the development of more and more elaborate adornments of clothing and symbols, badges, emblems, all anything you could think of that you could put a needle and thread to. Someone would add a bit of gold to enhance it. As we go forward in English history, the production of precious metal embroidery became an extremely important political tool. Not only did it symbolize all of the things that I mentioned before, but the English had developed this form of embroidery to such an extent that when William the Conqueror entered England in 1066, one of the very first things that he confiscated were the precious metal embroideries. They had never seen anything like it before. And what that did was create a demand for those English embroideries all throughout Europe and other parts of the world. Indeed, the Vatican became the largest customer of English precious metal embroideries during this time period. We know that this was so highly valued that Henry V actually took a piece of embroidery and divided it into 3 parts and gave it to bankers as collateral to prop up the royal treasury during wartime. Now, by the time Henry VIII and his daughter Elizabeth came along, they very well knew that this was an excellent political tool. And the art of the English precious metal embroidery really hit its peak during Tudor times. I have with me one old piece that I have in my collection that I'm going to hold up to the camera now. This is a little awkward, so please bear with me. This is a piece of lace that the Victorian Albert has placed at approximately 1600. And it's silver lace. We do have some glare, and I apologize, there's nothing we can do about it. But all of the lace that you see, this area is a silk applique that does actually have some thin metal sheets as part of the design. But all of what appears to be gray that is around it is made of silver threads. It's woven into lace. There are some areas where we have flat plates on it, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, and I'll show you some modern examples using those. So this is a piece of lace that has had some wonderful silk embroidery that has then been appliqued onto the lace to add some interest to this garment. Pardon me, I know it's a little awkward when I'm moving things around, so I appreciate your patience with me. Now, as we move forward today, what I'm going to show you next, before talking about how we execute this, is some pieces that you will see can be either very, very simple or as elaborate as you want to make them. One of the pieces that I'm going to bring forward now is a simple design. We've got some glare here. Let's see if I can cut down on that. There we go. This is a very simple design stitched on an iridescent silk. And the plates that I mentioned are actually flat pieces of gilded silver that have been drawn out. A silver-plated, excuse me, a gold-plated wire is drawn out to the diameter that is desired for whatever the end product is going to be. When we work with precious metals, we have a finite number of different materials, and getting the different techniques that we use is dependent on how we employ those materials. So this particular one, you can see the plates. There we go. On this acorn, we have flat, what is called broad plate. And on the other one, you'll see it looks as though there's a bit of a pattern to it. That is called whipped broad plate. And the only difference between the two is that whipped plate has a finer wire that has been wound around that flat broad plate. So you can see this is a very simple design. There's a great deal of negative space and allowing the silk to show through. So that's one example. I'm going to move to the next one. Now, this is a design that was done. Let's see if I can zoom in a little bit more for you. That was done for, sorry about this. I'm not bad with a needle and thread, but I'm a bit of a techno dunce when it comes to this technology. This is another very simple design. It looks a little bit more heavily embellished, but that's just by virtue of the techniques that were employed. This was a simple little dove of peace that was done for a class at the Smithsonian, a one-day class. Now, the next one I'm going to show you is a bit more elaborate. And the ground fabric is quite different on this. This is actually a piece that is executed on 18-count needlepoint canvas. And you can see we still have a lot of negative space showing, but in the center, those shamrocks are very, very highly padded, and they're much more solidly covered than the other two designs that we saw.
Deborah,
Ground fabrics could have been anything that you wanted, anything you can put, you can sew metal on. You can do it from fine, fine organza to very, very heavy wools or velvets or linens. Usually during Tudor time periods, these would be done on silk or velvet more often than anything else. And the silks would have been applied onto a muslin background just to make the silk a bit more durable during wear. But you can take just about any fabric that you can think of, and depending on the weight of the metal that you are employing and the technique that you are looking for, you can embellish it with precious metal threads.
Deborah, these are absolutely beautiful. Would you mind zooming out a little bit and moving it more to the right so we can see?
Certainly, thank you.
Yeah, no
Let's see
problem.
what we can do.
There, now we can see the full piece.
Oh, certainly. Thank you, Trinity.
Yeah.
So I'm holding it at an angle because of the glass. Of course, we will get a glare no matter how much I hold it. I'm just trying to hold it for you all so that there is a minimum amount of glare. Okay. Now, we'll move on to the next one. Now, this was part of a series of, symbols, emblems of the United Kingdom. And this, of course, is the shamrock for Scotland. And I don't know if you can see it or not. When I go into the demonstration aspect of this, I will talk about the preparation of the ground fabric prior to applying the metals. So in this instance, we have very heavy padding, heavy felt padding. It's actually about 3/8 of an inch thick at its thickest point. And down here, we have some other metals that have been applied over string and felt padding. I will talk in more detail about that later. But this, again, is executed on needlepoint canvas. You could have executed it on silk or wool or velvet. Velvet is a little trickier to deal with. It's not as forgiving as some of the other ground fabrics. If you apply some metals and you decide you don't like the way they look and you want to move them, if you take a thread out of velvet, it will leave a mark because some of that nap will be pulled out when you're reversing that. So we have to be a bit more deliberate with intention when we're working on velvet because of this aspect of being less forgiving. Here you can see we have one of the types of metal threads in the top of the thistles, another on the body of the thistles. And actually, these two thistles are one type of thread, and the center one is a different one. The stems of the thistles are a wonderfully wound precious metal twist called Grecian twist. And it has, as you can see, you've got some shiny and some matte, some shiny and some matte as you travel down the length of this. And that's because there are two different forms of precious metals that have been twisted together. We also have, I'm not sure if it's how easy it is for you to see, but we have some spangles. Spangles are much like sequins. And in the center of the thistle leaves, there is a row of spangles that has been held in place by a row of silver on top of it. Spangles are like sequins, however, they are not a complete circle because they're not stamped out of a solid sheet of metal. They're actually a single coil of metal, a single element of a coil of metal that's been flattened out. And I'll see if I can find some later in my, I'm not sure if I have them or not, but if you were to look at them very, very closely, there would be a little split in one side of it. Now, you may have noticed that the 400-year-old piece of lace that we spoke about didn't have the shine and the sheen to it. Well, precious metals will tarnish, whether they are gold-plated or whether they're silver or copper, they will tarnish with time. That being said, if you are a lover of precious metals, there are things you can do to retard the tarnish. I don't recommend them. The main one is to take your materials and spray it with Aquanet hairspray before you apply them. But those of us who really study precious metal embroidery and really love the history of it know that the change in this surface is part of the beauty of it. Now here is a piece, let's see. There we go. This is the piece that I did for certification at the Royal School of Needlework. And you will see in this piece, we have many different materials than you have seen in the others. The others have been limited to anywhere from 4 on up to a dozen. In this instance, we probably have about 15 different materials, and we've utilized many, many different techniques to make the design more elaborate. This one, again, was done on silk. One of the things that we've used here in this leaf is called Japan gold. Now, Japan gold is actual sheets of 24 karat gold, and it will not tarnish. But all of the other ones that are what we call silver gilt, or gold plated on a silver base, will eventually age. And if you look here, you can see that this is very sparkly. We've got solid silver up at the top of the blossom, and then blended into gold as we go down each petal. And although it's very sparkly because of the technique, it's not as highly reflective as the 24 karat gold that's used on this leaf. Up here again, you see some plating, some broad plates, some whipped plate. And in a few minutes, I will go over, I've got a little display for you of the different types of materials that are most commonly used today for embroiderers. Let me see. Okay. Now I'm going to transition into the preparation of your ground fabric. As with any kind of needlepoint, the first thing you have to do is you have to have a design, and you have to decide what your design is going to be. You will see that I have a piece of silk. Now this is not fully stretched, that's why it's rippled there. I have to relace my frame. I am working on what is called a slate frame. And a slate frame is the oldest form of needlepoint frame that was commonly used. It's been used since at least the 10th century. All professional embroiderers use some form of a slate frame. Japanese embroidery frames are very similar to slate frames. And slate, people ask me, why is it called a slate frame? Slate is simply the Old English word for slat. And we have 2 kinds of slats. You'll see I've got a crossbar, which is very similar to the round part of your scroll frame, and it has an opening in it. And then through that opening, I've placed the sidebar, and it's the same top to bottom on the frame. So once I have applied my silk, I've sewn my silk to a piece of muslin. Sorry, I'm going to back up a bit. The first thing I do is I apply my muslin to the slate frame. And you can see here where I stitched it on, there's some twill tape that's permanently applied to the frame at the top. Sorry about this. It's hard for me to see where you can see it. So here's some twill tape that's been permanently stapled to the top and bottom bar. I have then sewn the muslin to that twill tape. And I have used a cotter pin right by the top bar and again by the bottom one to stretch that ground fabric vertically. Now I'm stretching it so that it is good and taut, but it's not drum tight yet. The next thing I do is I apply a piece of twill tape to the sides of my muslin, which I then lace around the sidebars. And that's done on both the right and left-hand side of the frame. So this is sewn on in order that I can use a heavy string in a big fat needle and pierce the twill tape only, and I can get horizontal stretch in that way. So now I've got a nice taut piece of muslin, but it's not super, super tight. I then, you can see the stitches up here. I then place my silk that I'm going to use as my ground fabric, and I sew it to the muslin. Once it's sewn to the muslin, I will fully stretch the frame. Now, historically, when one would transfer a design to a piece of ground fabric, you would take a piece of vellum and draw your design on it. You would then take a nice fat needle and poke holes in the vellum so that if you were to hold it up to the light, you would be able to see holes right through your design. So what I would do is I would come along these lines and I'd poke a hole and another hole and another hole, and I would keep doing that until I had the main elements of my design all poked through the vellum. I would then attach the vellum to the silk and the muslin, because from now on forward, we're going to treat this as if it is one unit. So I would secure with pins, I would secure the vellum, and then I would take some pounce powder. The technique was called pricking and pouncing. Well, the pricking was pricking the holes into the design pattern, and the pouncing is then taking of a pad and dipping it in some pounce powder. Now, if you were working on a very dark ground fabric, you would want a light colored pounce. And that would have been made originally from ground cuttlefish bone. If you were working on a lighter background, you would want a dark colored pounce, and that historically was made from ground up charcoal. Or you could mix the two if you wanted your design in between. So I've taken my pad, I dip it in the powder, I then rub it over the design. Dip it and rub, dip it and rub, until all of that powder's gone through those little holes. And then I would remove the vellum completely, and the little dots that are left would give me the pattern that I would be using on which to actually stitch. Now that powder is obviously going to go away if you don't set it in some manner. And so what we would do is take a fine, fine little brush and some paint, and you would paint in gold or gray, depending on whether you were covering it with gilt or silver. And you would paint and connect those dots, just like in a child's design. And then your design would be permanently on your ground fabric. I have chosen to take a shortcut for this new design. And what I've done is I have drawn the elements of the next design onto a piece of tissue paper, acid-free tissue paper. So you can see I've drawn that with a marker. And I have then stab stitched. So there are, let's see if you can see the stitching with gray thread, because I'm going to be using a lot of silver. If we can see it or not. Whoops. Can't get you close enough, sorry. Wrong way. Here you can see the piece of thread that I used. And you can just about see the tiny little stitches that are going over, just little stab stitches, over the main elements of the design. The design itself is going to be, filled in much more thoroughly later on. There will be lots of curlicues and techniques that will be filling in all of this negative space. But for now, I just want the principal areas of the design to be highlighted. Now, I've taken this little piece of silk. Normally, we would use a nice fine silk. And I've put those elements of the design in here. And when I've got those all stitched in place with short, sharp motions, I will tear the tissue paper off and the stitching that is left behind shows me the main elements of my design, and I can then begin stitching. Now I'd like to show you some of the materials. Oh, blast. Glare, glare, glare. Some of the more commonly used materials. Okay, there we go. I think that'll do us pretty well. You can see that there is a variety of threads, and some of these are not, some of these are silver gilt, some of them are sterling silver, and others actually have some color to them. You can see up here, we've got some varied colors, and down here, we've got some varied colors. And perhaps what I can do, if I take the lids off, some of these, you'll be able to see them more clearly. This is some of that Grecian twist that I mentioned. Now, when we're working with precious metals, as general categories, we talk about soft pearls and hard pearls. Pearl is spelled P-U-R-L, and it simply means coiled wire. The advent of wire drawing in the 12th century is what gives us this variety of materials that we can use. Prior to that, all of the metals were simply sheets of metal hammered out and cut into the finest slices that they could to have threads. But with the advent of wire drawing, we could now pull those wires out to the tinier and tinier diameters. And this gave us a wider variety of materials to use. I have a little piece here that is simply a sampler. I'm going to zoom in. It's a sampler of some of the different threads that you see. Now, these are all silver gilt. These are all gold plated. And here we have, you see there are some threads that stand up right off of the ground fabric. Here we have the same technique executed in 2 different finishes. And down here, the same technique executed in 6 different combinations. Over here, we've taken one of our threads and overstretched it and then wrapped it with a piece of contrasting silk to give it some color. Sorry, hope I'm not making anybody seasick. There we go. The next piece is going to illustrate for us the development of a design. Here you can see I have transferred the body of these blossoms. Here's my stab stitching. I've transferred that element of the design. The next thing I wanted to do was to add some padding. So I've got some soft string that I've put on either side of these petals to give them some dimension. I've then covered them with felt. Sorry, I'm trying to get this so we have less and less glare, and it is challenging.
You're completely fine, Deborah. Everyone's learning Zoom and everything, so.
Okay, thank you, Trinity.
You're great. No, and I can let you know if we
There we go, that's better.
Yep.
Okay. You'll see here, we've got spangles again. These are all techniques that were used during Elizabethan times. The pearls are real pearls. Let's see the pearls. And then we've got 14 karat gold beads. This is actually a piece that I did for the Folger Shakespeare Library. In the Founders Room, there is a wonderful portrait, original portrait of Queen Elizabeth I. And this is an interpretation of the gold and silver threads that run down the center of that gown and all over it. She had over 2,000 gowns in the royal wardrobe, and they were all absolutely magnificent. So, now I need to find, here is a piece that I'm in the process of executing. Well, that shows up pretty well. These are chimney tops. If you've ever been to England and you've seen the Tudor chimney tops, they have wonderful, highly patterned brickwork that they are made out of. And being a lover of gold and a lover of all things English, I decided I wanted to do a piece illustrating the chimney tops, but all in precious metal threads. Now here I've got a ground fabric that's called Congress cloth. You can't get this, we can get Congress cloth, but we can't get gilt shot ivory Congress cloth anymore. You can still get white, I believe. So I'm allowing the fabric itself to be its background, just as I did with the silks. And I've used a wide variety of patterns and different materials in order to form my chimney tops. Now they're not done. As you can see over here, you can see there's some felt padding under there. But unlike many of the other designs, these are solid. They are solidly covered with gold. Now what I'd like to do is, hopefully this will show up. Let me see. Nope. Nope. Trinity, how does that look? Does that look all nothing but glare?
It was better now if you angle it maybe a little bit, like we've been doing, or the other way.
There's no glass on it. Let me see if zooming in will help.
So we see the circles now.
Yeah, those are tacks.
Yep. Yeah.
All right. What I will do, I was talking about, I'm going to put this over here first and zoom out a little bit. Whoops, wrong way. Remember I was talking about soft pearls and hard pearls. Pearl, these two are called pearl. And as you can see, I think, this is a coiled wire. There we go. You can see the wire there.
Yes.
It's a coiled wire. And it is more tightly coiled at one end than the other. This is how the more tightly coiled end is how it comes from the manufacturer. Then you will see a middle section that is slightly stretched. When we work with pearl, we slightly stretch it just enough. It's almost imperceptible, but we stretch it just enough so that our thread will pop down between the coils. Pearl is never plunged. It's always stitched only to the surface of our ground fabric. And you want the thread to pop down between the coils without distorting the metal. As we move to the other end, it's more highly stretched. And you can either stitch it in place, couch it in place as it is, or you can add that contrasting silk that I showed you earlier. I can take a piece of silk and I can wrap it around those coils, couch it in place with a silk of the same color, and that gives us the two-tone look that we had. This is a sterling silver wire. This one is the same thing in silver gilt. Now you can see, I'm going to pan out again. You can see that these are quite stiff. They have a lot of body to them. It will hold its shape. Obviously, as you apply it, you can curve it with your stitching if you choose to. But I wanted to point out the difference between this metal and something like this. Can you see how floppy that is? And this one. These are soft pearls. If we tried to couch these in place, we would destroy them with our stitching. So instead, I have a student who says, if you can stitch over or through something, you can do precious metal embroidery. And it's true. The one thing that I love about precious metal embroidery so much is that it appears to be far more difficult and time consuming than it actually is. So you get a lot of bang for your buck. We do need to strengthen the thread with beeswax. This is a piece of pure beeswax that I have been using for many years, because when it gets all chunky and torn up from the thread, I simply pop it in the microwave, it melts a little bit, and I pop it back together. I'm going to pan out a little bit more, because sometimes it seems these things are clearer. So I cannot stitch over this, or I will damage it. What I have to do is I have to cut it into individual segments. And, excuse me, I measure and determine what length of chip, which is what we call these individual pieces, of whatever I am using. In this case, we have something called bright check pearl that is faceted. Look at that. And it's more highly reflective than the one that's next to it, which is called smooth pearl, which is not faceted. But they are both very, very fine, delicate coiled wires. So in order to apply this to the work, what I have to do is load it on my needle. Remember, it's a cylinder. So if you think of it like a bugle bead, I simply put my needle through the center of the cylinder and load it on my thread. And in that way, you would apply it to your work. I had wanted to do a few of these for you on this ground fabric. I'll put this one down. But I'm not sure it will show up because of the color of the fabric. Hold on, there we go. So what I do is I will pre-measure the chip. I've loaded it on my needle, and then I very simply sink my needle, making a stitch that is the same length as the chip. If I make my stitch too short, the chip will sit proud. And obviously, if I want it to sit up, I can put string through the middle of it, string padding, and then it will mound up the way it is, mounded up here. You can see on the shell, I've put heavy string padding in each segment. I've covered it with felt, and then I've covered those with the individual pre-cut strips. Now, some of you have noticed I've been using this tool. This is a tool called a malor. It's sterling silver. You can see the hallmarks. We use this to groom our gold. If you've applied a piece of pearl and you want a nice graceful curve, and your curve has a little kink in it and it's not so graceful, then what I can do is I can take this, go around the edge, and I can groom my gold. The pointed end is often used, you can use it like a laying tool, those of you who are familiar with that. But in precious metal embroidery, we use it to penetrate ground fabric and heavy padding in those areas where we might want to plunge some of our other materials. Many of these metals can be wound around a silk core, and those actually have to have their ends plunged and secured to the back of the work. Well, I think I've babbled on enough. So I'd like to know if any of you have some questions that you would like to forward to me, Miss Trinity, and I might be able to answer.
Yes, we did have a few come in. So going back to those traditional frames that you were talking about, where would someone go to get one of those?
You can order those at any fine needlework store. They're called a slate frame. In Stitches in Alexandria, where I'm going to be teaching a class in next March in the DC area. It's an extended study program on precious metal embroideries, and the ladies can I've been told that they may order their slate frames from the shop in Stitches in Alexandria, which is literally 2 stoplights from Woodlawn.
Great, thank you. And then also going off of that, would you share with us the specific powder we use with the vellum to get the pattern from the vellum onto the stitching fabric?
Well, nowadays you can order from any number of people a pricking and pouncing kit. And that comes with a pounce pad. We used to make our own pounce pads, but it's very inexpensive. Many places sell them. The one that comes to mind to me is Sarah Homfray, Homfray. Sarah is, I think it's Sarah, S-A-R-A. I'm not sure if there's an H at the end of her word or not. She is a graduate of the Royal School of Needlework, and she has a website, and she has some wonderful precious metal kits, and she will sell you a pounce kit, and it comes with different shades of pounce powder. I don't know what it's made out of, because my familiarity is the old pounce, which was either ground charcoal, ground cuttlefish bone, or a combination of the two.
Great, thank you. And then what was the ground used for the gold chimney pots?
That is gilt shot Congress cloth. Congress cloth is a needlework. It's a form of canvas. It's 24 to 26 inches per linear, threads per linear inch. And the particular one that I used that you saw was a cream color, which is no longer being manufactured, but I believe it is being manufactured in white, and you can get it either gilt or silver shot.
Great, thank you. Oh, and it looks like Diane Clark added the link to the Sarah's website into the chat. So if anyone's interested in that, to check out the chat and also add your other questions into there. So out of all the pieces that you've shown us today, what's your favorite one and why?
Well, I have two. Usually it's the most recent one because I've just finished it and I've had the joy of the journey of execution.
Mm-hmm.
But the one that was displayed at the Smithsonian, I'm very proud of. I don't know that if I pan out, you might be able to see it. You can see my interest in Tudor just by looking at the designs. Let's try that. Okay. This is a piece called Emblems of Elizabeth. And this was the 2018 Best in Show winner at Woodlawn. So I'm very proud of this piece. I hadn't intended to enter it in anything. It was just after many, many years of having a needlepoint company, I was not used to executing designs solely for my own enjoyment. And to have it recognized by the wonderful professional judges, I don't know how they do what they do, at Woodlawn. And then it hung for a year and a half at the Smithsonian and in a juried exhibit there. So this is a favorite of mine.
It's absolutely beautiful. Oh, just all shiny. It's so great.
Sorry,
No,
glare is a problem.
great.
I know. Are there any other questions?
None others have come in so far, but I just want to thank you again for joining us and showcasing all the sparkly side of embroidery, and showing us just how to use the different styles of gold work.
Well, one thing I am often asked, so since we have a little time,
Sure.
People ask me, how did I become involved in this kind of embroidery? Oh, I told you I had two favorites. The other one is the one from the Royal School, this one. That's the other favorite. My interest began as a 3-year-old. I was at a party at my grandparents' home at the seashore. And my Uncle Charlie came walking in with a blazer with the family crest on it. And the sun was setting and it was glinting off the gold threads. And I am told that I called it Uncle Charlie's Sparkly. And that when I asked him if I could have it and he said no, that I pouted for the rest of the day. So Uncle Charlie's Sparkly created a monster that ended up with a lifelong love of this beautiful, beautiful form of embroidery. It is, after all, when we think of things gold, when we think of things that are of particularly fine quality and treasured and valued, we say that they are the gold standard. And so I just very, very much, I enjoy all forms of needlework, but this one is my favorite. And I hope I've piqued some of your interest and that you'll think about giving it a try.
Yeah, you definitely piqued mine. Oh, that's so great and such an interesting story how it all connects. And now,
Well, thank you so much, everyone. Enjoy the exhibit at Woodlawn.
Mm-hmm. Yes,
and I hope perhaps I'll see some of you next March in Washington.
That would be great. And for everyone else who's on the call, we invite you to register for all of our other upcoming programs related to the Needlework Show. Upcoming this Thursday is a program called Color of Mood with Carolyn Shaw. Then coming up on Thursday, May 20th is Stitching History. On May 24th is the Transformative Power of Textiles. And on May 27th is Occupying White Spaces. So they're all virtual programs that start at noon. You can find them all on our website and register them. And if you're coming out to the show, if you're in the area, we especially invite you to our cumulative tent sale that's going to be going on the last day of the show, May 31st. So think about the gift shop that we normally have, but a lot bigger. But yeah, thank you so much for all joining us, and we hope to see you soon.
Bye-bye.